But first, there are thousands of unsolved murders in London, some dating back not just decades, but hundreds of years. The most famous of those, the Jack the Ripper.
It's been more than 100 years since Jack the Ripper's murder, and it's still one of the most mysterious and scary crimes ever. This notorious serial killer, whose horrible crimes, the terrifying crimes that happened in London's Whitechapel area in 1888, have captured people's attention all over the world. His real name, however, had been kept secret until now. After 137 years, the real name finally been found out about: Jack the Ripper. We're going to change history today and bring ending a disturbing mystery after a long time. This is Jack the Ripper's story. Finally figured out. Allow us to begin. What happened in the past that led to Jack the Ripper? The Whitechapel opened in the late 1800s. Area of London was a stark example of poverty and social unrest in the city. Tucked away in the East End, Whitechapel was a maze of dirty, small streets that were full of poor families. It was hard for refugees and workers to stay alive because their living conditions were so bad. In 1888, this area had turned into a haven for crime, disease, and hopelessness, a place where the flaws that one of history's most notorious serial killers would soon take advantage of, the Killer Jack. The harsh surroundings of the area showed how unequal Victorian society was. England, where quick manufacturing had helped some people's economies grow but made things worse for others, how hard it is for working poor people. Whitechapel's population was growing because new people had moved there. A lot of Eastern European Jews who were fleeing oppression were among those who lived there. Being crammed into run-down tenements with poor sanitation and few job prospects. This background of poverty and social failure made people very afraid and suspicious, which led to a scary string of crimes that would happen. Scare not just London but everyone in the world. The killings that were linked to Jack the Ripper happened. Taking place over a short but very exciting time period from August to November 1888. Beginning with the brutal murder of Mary and Nichols on August 31, 1888, the killer caused a lot of fear. Annie Chapman came in second, right after, on September 8. The first victims were both neighborhood women. Life on the edges of society because they are poor and addicted. What shocked people, both the victims and the police, was how violent the attacks were. The victims were not only killed but also mangled in ways that suggested the person who did it knew a lot about anatomy. The third, and Elizabeth Stride, who may have been the most famous victim, was killed on September 30, just hours after, eventually by Catherine Eddowes, whose body was mutilated in a very horrible way. Mary Jane Kelly, the last official victim, was found on November 9, 1888, in her own home, with injuries that were so bad they seemed to represent the cruel mark of a killer. These 5 killings, which are sometimes called the canonical 5, most scholars and criminologists agree that these crimes were all committed by the same person. Some people think that the Ripper's shadow is connected to other unsolved killings in the area. People in Victorian England were deeply and widely affected by these killings. Whitechapel's already bad image as a dangerous and unpleasant area got even worse when the killings' violence and lack of clarity added to the general worries of a society that is having a hard time. With lots of new cities and class differences. The killings showed how unfair things really were. Problems that poor people in cities face, and sparked a public discussion about how bad social policy, policing, and health care for underserved groups. The story also got a lot of attention from the media. Wildness that would become a signature part of modern crime stories. During that time, newspapers, in order to get more readers, newspapers made the crime seem more shocking by using shocking headlines, and speculative, often racist or xenophobic ideas were aimed at Whitechapel's immigrant population. The scary pseudonym, Jack the Ripper, was made up by the press after getting a letter that was said to be from the killer himself, but many people now think it was a fake. Caught the public's attention. This media storm not only made people more afraid, but it also put pressure on the Metropolitan Police to step up their searches, even though they don't have many forensic tools. And the tools for investigation that were available at the time. The deaths were looked into by the police and limited by the time's primitive forensic science, lack of police tools, and the Whitechapel has a lot of complicated social relations. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police did a lot of raids and questioning, but it was very hard for them to get information. Getting reliable proof or witnesses you can trust. The disorderly state of Whitechapel's streets, along with a general lack of trust between people and police, this meant that many possible leads dried up. The killer's skill to avoid being caught led to a lot of speculation. There were accusations and conspiracy ideas from everyone in the area to well-known people in the era, including professionals and even upper-class British people. Only this air of mystery made people even more interested in the case, which led to a huge number of books, plays, and later movies. Turning Jack the Ripper into a scary, dark mythical person who stands for the unknown, the dark side of Victorian London. In terms of history, the Ripper killings show a city that was changing. Society that is having a hard time keeping up with the fast changes in modern times. Of course, the poor care how the world is changing is not talked about much. At the time, this was also true. In the end, for them, the world was just as people who Jack the Ripper hurt. The scary story of Jack the Ripper is always linked to the sad lives of 5 women were brutally killed. They are called the canonical 5 victims. All of these women who lived in London's East End and had to deal with poverty and struggle in the crowded, the streets of Whitechapel are very dark. It is said that Mary Ann Nichols was the first of the 5 deaths. Was found dead in Bucks Row on the morning of August 31, 1888. It is now Durward Street. The woman, who was 43 years old, had been through a lot in her life. She lost her husband and is having a hard time with drinking. It was up and down for Nichols where he lived. He was known to hang out in the poor parts of Whitechapel. That terrible morning, she was found dead, with horrible marks that would soon become unique to the killer. The community was shocked by her death, which started a dark time in London's past. On September 8, 1888, a little more than a week later, Annie Chapman was found in the garden of 9 Hanbury Street, 29. Chapman was 47 years old, and like Nichols, he had been poor his whole life. Addiction and the breakup of families. She had lost her husband not long ago and was living in a shared housing unit and trying to make money by prostitution and odd jobs. A popular way for many women in Whitechapel to stay alive. Her crime was much worse than most terrible. The brutal way Chapman was killed made it seem like the killer knew a lot about anatomy, making people worry and speculate. The killings of Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride on the fear in London got worse on the night of September 30, 1888. Dear Elizabeth Stride, the woman, who went by the name Long Liz, was 44 years old and from Sweden. Who lives in Whitechapel. Stride's murder was less violent than those of the other victims. Because of this strange event, police thought that the killer might have been stopped, or being forced to leave too soon. Stride was found in Dutfield's yard, which is near Berner Street. People started to wonder if all the killings in Whitechapel were linked after she was killed. Catherine Eddowes was 46 years old when she was killed 45 minutes after Stride on the same night. Old and has Irish roots. Her life, like the lives of the other victims, was hard because she was poor. Hard times. Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square in the City of London. He was identified by more violent mutilations than any other subject before. There was a lot of time between these 2 killings, and the location suggested a terrifying rampage, which made people even more scared and made it impossible for the cops to handle. On November 9, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly, the last official victim, was found in her room at 13 Miller's Court, Dorset Street. Kelly was the youngest girl killed. She was only 25 years old. Is thought to have been a neighborhood escort who had a rough life full of poverty and instability. Her death was the worst and most personal. The cuts and wounds were much worse and more widespread than killings in the past. Kelly was killed inside, unlike the others, which gave the killer a chance to escape. He had a lot more time to sign his awful work. The clear links between these 5 killings were the mutilated signatures that were always made by the same person. The killer looked like be both brutal and precise, and maybe even know a lot about anatomy or surgery. The horrific cuts and wounds led the media and police to name the unknown attacker. Since then, Jack the Ripper has become a name that means fear and mystery. What do these facts tell us about the killer? Don't worry, his name will become clear in the end. But we need to see things the way people did at the time he lived. How the killer does what they do. The killer's ability to sneak through Whitechapel's dark streets without being seen pointed to a man who either lived there or worked there. Lived in the area for a long enough time to learn about its geography and rhythms. How the targets were picked, escorts who were women wasn't random. Among these women were some of the most powerful in business and society. People on the outside in Victorian London. They often worked alone at night in dimly lit places. Additionally, because of their job, they were used to going into private areas with strangers. The Ripper took advantage of this by finding women who they are likely alone, need money badly, and won't fight back or sound the alarm if they are led into a dark room, street or garden. The killer's method seems to have included a careful choice of targets, watching his possible victims from afar or having short conversations with them to make sure they fit the description he wanted. He looked like he had the self-control and patience to watch without doing anything until the right chance came up. It's likely that he looked like he blended in with the locals, making himself invisible. He might have even looked decent. Or not dangerous enough to make people not suspect them. Once he knew who the target was, he would wait for that quiet time when no one was around to see what was going on. This careful timing can be seen in the fact that many of the attacks happened just minutes before the bodies were found, which suggests that the killer always picked a spot with the least amount of risk and worked quickly and accurately. For example, the killing of Elizabeth Stride on the night of September 30, 1888, is thought to might have been stopped, maybe by a bystander, so the killing didn't have the normal cutting up. This means that the Ripper didn't like being rushed and worked at a steady pace. When he was alone. Another thing that is clear is that Jack the Ripper used Whitechapel's plan for his own good. There were a lot of alleys, courts, backyards, and guest houses in the area. Perfect for quickly getting away after a crime. This urban terrain made it possible for the killer to disappear. The shadows around times. At the time, investigators were very upset by how little physical some things that were found show that the killer had planned exit routes or at least knew about them. What to do to stay ahead of the cops in a crazy place. Due to the fact that the fact that the victims were killed only a few minutes walk from each other adds to the idea that the Ripper had some kind of mental or physical connection to the area. He didn't just walk around London at random. He instead worked in a small area where he was safe and felt in charge. Another thing that the Ripper did over and over was that he often struck on weekends or near the end of the month, which is a strange trend that made some researchers think he might have had a day job or that his behaviors were based on some kind of internal schedule. Maybe more it's striking that people can do these kinds of things over and over again without feeling anything. As well as the self-control shown in getting away without being caught or hurting themselves. He was never seen running away from a crime scene and never caught with bloody clothes or a gun. Even though people were more careful and police patrols were increased after the second murder. This shows that he not only planned each move but also did his best to make sure he could go away without a trace later. The victims, who are usually older women who have had hard lives and not much social support, it's also possible that the Ripper had a certain dislike for people, or obsession with this particular group of people. Some contemporary crime profilers say that the killings were not just random acts of violence, they were also motivated by misogyny, which may have been driven by a traumatic event or a crazy belief system. The killer was able to make a link just long enough to get the women to fall into a trap, and then acted quickly and viciously, shows the terrifying the idea that someone could look normal on the outside while having violent urges inside. The Ripper's method also included the scary step of setting up the crime scenes. Even though the killings were brutal and quick, the way the bodies were arranged and the parts that were taken out suggested a ritualistic or symbolic meaning. There are experts who say that the use of some parts, like the uterus or kidneys, might have been meant to be a scary signature or message, which may have shown the killer's mental state or symbolic anger toward women. The severe cuts and wounds also showed that the killer was more than just violent murder. It came from a deep-seated anger or mental illness and was meant to insult and humiliate the people who died. Of course, this cruel killing spree made people feel a huge amount of London is full of fear. The cops, led by Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline, didn't understand what was going on. The killings were so precise and brutal that they shocked and horrified everyone. Even after thorough studies, the killer's name remained a mystery, mostly because the attacks were carried out in secret and it's a social mess in Whitechapel. Many people were scared because of what the press said, with sensationalized news stories that focused on how horrifying the mutilations were, guessed about the killer's medical knowledge. What did the police find out, though? The first investigation and problems. The study was from the start there were problems with who had authority because the murders happened in places that were patrolled by both the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police. The first victim in the Bible was Mary Ann Nichols, found in Whitechapel's Bucks Row, which was under the control of the Metropolitan Police. But, the death of Elizabeth Stride happened in Dutfield's Yard, which is in the City of London. Because of this division, the two police teams had to work together, which wasn't always easy. The overlap sometimes made it hard to talk to each other and led to different ideas, which made things even harder of coming up with a coherent plan for the study. Even with these problems, Chief Inspector Aberline, a seasoned agent who has worked on high-profile cases before, was in charge of the tries to catch the killer. Things that investigative science couldn't do in the late 1800s. 200 were some of the hardest things to get around when they were looking for Jack the Ripper. The tools of crime today, forensic pathology, fingerprints, DNA analysis, and other advanced techniques used at crime scenes, were either very young or not there at all. For example, fingerprinting wasn't used all the time yet. It was part of the job of the cops in London at the time, and DNA wouldn't be found for almost 100 years. People who were there, media, and even police officers often messed up crime scenes, making it even less likely that any physical proof will be kept. Documentation through photographs was used, but not very much, and medical exams were limited by what doctors knew at the time, which meant that the killer's precise knowledge of anatomy could not be fully used to find clues. Witness statements were very important to the case, but it's not always clear how reliable they were. Wasn't always clear-cut. A lot of the people who lived in Whitechapel were poor and moved around a lot, or don't trust the police, which makes it harder to get correct information. Besides that, because the killings happened early in the morning, not many people were able to get a good look at the attacker. Several important eyewitness reports talked about a suspicious man who was seen with the victims not long before their deaths, but the details were very different. For example, some reports said a guy of average height and some people said they had different physical traits based on their dark clothes. One of the most well-known, Israel Schwartz, was one of the witnesses who said he saw a guy beat up a woman.